Hello friends, painting enthusiasts, and welcome to a new video. Today we are going to turn a simple blank canvas into something vibrant, warm, and something that really just feels like summer. Moving along, we're not actually going to start by putting paint on the canvas. I'm going to head over to my drafting desk and start a bit of a sketch for just figuring out where all of my subjects are. I personally like to boot up Photoshop, apply a grid, do a sketch in reference to that. However, if you don't love the drawing process in general, you just want to jump right into the painting, you can download the Traceable up over on my Patreon, where you can also get the ad-free version of this video. That said, once we have our sketch complete, we are going to go ahead and select our brushes. We are going to pick our pigments, and we can jump into the painting process. Let's start with titanium white, burnt sienna, cadmium red, cerulean blue, Naples yellow, and green gold. It's the only golden pigment I'm using. Everything else is Winsor and Newton. And last but not least, Mars black. Yet again, we'll grab our 1-inch flat-headed brush, and we'll also make the brush just a little bit damp to help keep our paint wet longer, and it'll also help with the blending process. Now, for our first mix, we'll grab an abundance of titanium white, a hint of our cerulean blue, and a hint of our Mars black. The goal here is to make an incredibly bright blue for our sky. As for application, we're just going to head up into the openings of our drawn foliage. I'm going to overlap said drawing, that way we can overlap our foliage over the sky. And these actual applications are done fairly softly. That way we can avoid a streaky aesthetic. We'll also use the corner of the brush to work in a lot of little openings here, just to create some dimension in the foliage. Now we'll just fill in the bottom portions, and just like that, we have a sky. Now, once the canvas is fully dry to the touch, we are going to work on our foliage. For our mix, we'll grab an abundance of green gold, hint of our Mars black, and an equal amount of titanium white. Here we want a mid-value green for our base layer. I think I'll also throw in just a hint of our Naples yellow, which will thicken up the pigment quite nicely. With this, we are going to be a little bit loose in the initial application. You can see that I'm really throwing my brush around, and that's just so that we get some unique protrusions in our clusters of foliage. I'm also going to start working on the left-hand side and use this X-shaped pattern to get around. That way we move the pigment not only left and right, but also up and down, leaving lots of little openings. And here we're just going in with a second layer, making it nice and thick. As you can see, this brush renders some pretty rough edges, so we're going to switch our brush and get detailed with it. For said details, use a nice sharp liner brush. Also, make sure it's nice and damp to condense your bristles. And as for our application, I'm just going to do a bit of a tap and a drag around the edges. This is going to give us the aesthetic of individual little leaves which are protruding, catching light, and rendering a much more unique and intentional image. This is the basis for our realism, though it won't look real until we've applied our shadows and our highlights. It's also worth noting that I like to be fairly loose with my brush. That way we have a wide set of applications. At this point, we just want to move all the way around our image and make sure that the green edges are nice and unique. It's so quiet, you can barely hear the brush strokes. It's also worth noting that as we work around our edges and we run out of paint, our pigment will become less opaque, it'll be more transparent, and that's actually great because it'll render a lighter mix, which will look like more light is passing through it. So it'll immediately start creating some depth in your image. pretty soon you'll have a nice, complete, and aesthetic base layer. Also, if you end up doing just a little bit too much greenery, we can go back in and add some highlights using the titanium white and the cerulean blue to rebuild the sky. And I'm just going to apply this through small randomized dots, typically close to the outskirts of the larger pieces of foliage. And this is just nice little openings to complement the sky and show that the foliage doesn't get thick until we get to these more central areas. So, easy way to add detail. Once our sky is fully dry, we are going to head in with some shadows, especially through the larger bodies of foliage. For our next mix, we will need more of our green gold, but significantly more Mars black, hint of titanium white, rendering a shadow to be seen through the openings in our foliage. Once mixed, we'll switch to our fan brush for the application. As you can see, it has myriad of tiny little bristles, which will each make a unique impression on the canvas. As for application, I'm going to begin in the larger centers of my foliage, and then I'll slowly work my way to the edges, lessening the amount of taps in those areas. We want the middle to be dense and full of shadows, but the outskirts will have a lot of light working through them, so less of these. It's also worth noting that this is going to make it look a little messy for a layer. That's okay. It's going to provide a great base for some realism and detail real soon. It's worth noting that the majority of my applications I apply with just about a third of the brush, not the full thing, because I don't want to render larger lines. But if you do need to move through a very intentional area, you can press little lines into the canvas and maneuver those delicate spots. It's also worth noting that I'm going to move over previously applied areas a couple of times just to build out more of that texture. And now we're just going to fill in the right hand side here in the same way we did the left, with caution around the edges and playfulness towards the center. Now we'll start working on our first layer of mid-value highlights. We want this to be slightly brighter than our base layer. So this is really just the original mix with slightly more of our Naples yellow, and we probably won't use too much titanium white because we want the warmth and the vibrancy in the yellow as the highlight. So now, for the first time with this brush, we will add some water. And this is going to, as you see, condense a lot of our bristles to the point where it forks the brush. So now rather than making 20 impressions, we make 5, maybe 6. Great for adding larger details, but still a good number of them. Now let's apply this beautiful pigment to our canvas. For the most part, our light's coming this way, so we want the majority of our highlights on the left-hand side of our foliage here, and it's slowly going to run out and dissipate as we work towards the right-hand side, but it is going to build this nice initial volume in the painting. And now we'll just head on over to the left-hand side, and we'll do more of the same. These highlights will exist also greatly around the edges because we'll just have more light streaming through those areas. So make sure you bounce around and give it a good diverse application. Now we'll grab some pigment for our branches, which we are going to add more foliage on top of right after. Now we'll grab said pigment and render a darker mix of a brown using our burnt sienna, our green gold, Mars black, and a hint of our titanium white. Now we'll also be applying this pigment with the larger flat-headed brush but we're not going to do so in a elongated application. I'm going to do so in a collection of tap and drags, as that'll give us a much more natural look for our wood. We can also tap on smaller branches when we want things to be much smaller, just like so. And we'll do another one to the right, which will just get lost in this foliage. You want sometimes for it to go and head into it, head out, get lost. That's just going to make it a lot more interesting as a whole. Now on the left hand side we have this beautiful movement of foliage, and I'm going to mirror that to a point with my branch here. Then I'll have it expand. As it expands, as it moves up, it should get smaller and smaller because these branches are younger and they're not fully grown. And we'll just throw a couple randomly poking out of foliage like so. Very tiny taps when we want real detail. And a couple other straight ones so that they don't look too intentionally different. There we go. We don't need too many, and we are going to layer over all of them. If you find it difficult to do all of it with the larger flat-headed brush, the liner is also fantastic for these smaller branches. And as you can see, with an incredibly subtle application and stroke, we can get our smallest branches yet. We want them to crisscross because that will make them look realistic, but we'll also just throw some in between the openings of foliage as well. It'll all amalgamate to something pretty special. So from there, we want a highlight for those branches, and we'll just do so with a hint more Naples yellow and burnt sienna. That's perfect. As for the application, I'm just going to go ahead and apply this to the left-hand sides of all of these branches, because it's essentially just going to be a little bit of light working its way through the sky, through the openings, onto them, and adding a little bit of dimension. The green gold we added to the mix of burnt sienna will also make it nice and cohesive with our background. It's also worth noting that I'm not just doing the edge, I'm also going to start working my way into the larger bodies of the branches with slight taps as well, and that'll just give us a nice transition from light to dark. Now I'll head in with a second layer. Every time we add a layer, it'll be a little bit brighter because we're building on brighter layers rather than darker layers. Now we'll head on over to the left-hand side, and I'm still painting the left-hand side of these branches, though we can paint the tops when it gets more horizontal, because we're just thinking about where the light is and how it will touch the branches. Now here we're kind of breaking the rules because again, this area is a bit more facing upwards where the left-hand side is facing downwards. So we're just going to add the highlight to the essentially top of the branch. But then when they get more vertical like this, again, we can go back to adding that on the left-hand side. So we need to be aware of the general form, the trajectory of our branches, as it will change a little bit. But for the most part, it's the left-hand side unless it's somewhat horizontal, in which case it's the top. There we go. Now, I don't typically do a lot of time lapses on the channel, but this part is pretty repetition heavy, and you can get the general idea from what I did there. We're just essentially adding that highlight and trying to apply it to each and every one of our little branches. That said, once this is done, we can head back in to adding foliage on top of it so that it does feel three-dimensional and really work within the subject. Now we can start playing with some highlights. We'll mix up an even brighter highlight than that which we've had before, using our Naples yellow, our green gold, a hint of titanium white to just desaturate it a little bit, and the smallest hint of Mars black as well. The actual application process will start on the edges of our foliage. This can be overlapping that which we've already done, but it's also going to extend slightly into that clear sky, and you can see it very quickly adds this bonus luminosity. Here's an example of us bringing it in, because these highlights will connect with protruding pieces of foliage and they will overlap various portions of our branches as well. Now, this pigment is quite thin, as is the green gold. We don't have a lot of titanium white to thicken it up. So if you want something opaque, you'll probably have to go over it a couple of times, but that's okay. It just gives you more opportunity to refine, make it exactly what you want it to be. And once we have all of that edging complete, we're going to look for the openings, and we can tap additional little leaves on top of our pre-existing highlights, on top of our branches, really start to build some good layering and depth through all of it. Because the pigment is relatively thin, I'm not using a lot of water. The brush is small enough that we don't need to condense the bristles too greatly, but the goal here is to render a very fine, sharp leaf. And all of this is essentially protrusions which stand out, catches light. We don't want to cover all of the darker areas either, because of course we need that for contrast. So it's all about a balance right now. We don't want too many, but if we don't put any in front of it, it just won't look natural. So there's an in-between, there's a balance, and I think this is quite nice. There we go. So with here, I really love this larger branch, and I'm going to do my best to maintain it through the addition of these. It doesn't mean I'm not going to go over it here and there, because I am. Here you can see highlight streaming in from there. It's going to be streaming this way as well. It is going to start covering these branches, but this larger body, I can just put a couple on here and there. I think that this is enough light to stream in. It's covering this tree to a greater extent, but that's fine. I think this one's a much more unique and visually valuable one. All right, now yet again, we are building a highlight. It's going to be even brighter than the last, and the difference is we're going to interject a lot more titanium white than we did previously. This is going to make for a much brighter green. Now we're going to jump back into this with the fan brush. It is damp, so it's forking. We'll get larger applications with it, but I just found while I was working with the liner, I was making things a little more intentional than I wanted to be, and this will just add a good amount of randomization to our applications, make it feel a little bit more real again. So we're going to go in and just apply a good amount of light around our openings, let it spread out. Occasionally it will poke out of the darker areas and create this really beautiful contrast, but for the most part we are sticking towards those edges still. And then if we want to do anything truly intentional, we can switch over to the liner again. Just like that. It's also worth noting that if you're finding your brushes aren't making all of these same markings, you can get the exact brush set I'm using in the video description. It is my brush set. I use it for all the lessons here on this channel. And again, I love the fan brush because we can use it as a stiff bristled fan brush when it's dry, but we can also change it to a soft bristled fan brush for larger applications like this when it's damp. So very versatile, and it saves you from buying and switching between brushes. I like that a lot. I really like that. Great volume. So now we'll head on over to the left-hand side, and yet again I'm going to begin by applying this highlight to these edges. I'm not pressing the entirety of the brush into the canvas. We are simply going in with about a third of it, just enough to get a number of strokes, but not too many. Okay, so now that we have our highlights applied there, we're going to take a little bit of a break from the top area, and we're going to start heading into the brickwork. This is exciting, but it's also going to start in a very approachable manner. So our next step is the brick. However, we're not going to paint every brick individually to begin with. You can see this area that's in between our bricks. You can see it in the shadows, you can see it in the highlights. Here it's more of a bright whitish cream, other side it's more of a blue. We're going to paint a base layer, and the base layer on this side is going to be more of that grayish blue. Here it'll be that creamish white, and we'll also do some of the shadows. Then we'll build our bricks on top of that, which includes their textures and details. My first mix will be for the shadow side, so we'll use a lot of cerulean blue, Mars black, and titanium white. We want a mid to dark value bluish gray, and maybe, just maybe, we throw in a hint of our green gold, because there will be a lot of reflective green light in the painting. And you know what, on second thought, before I begin, I'm going to throw in just a little bit of burnt sienna. That way it's also cohesive with the soon to be warmer side. So it's an eclectic color, and we are going to apply a great amount of it around our foliage, in between openings in our foliage. I'm just using the corner of my brush to do that. But work this all throughout this portion of the painting. And right here we have this intersection of the door, so I'll just paint around that for now. I'm applying very thick layer, and I'm also not trying to blend it out too perfectly. If there are areas that are a little more blue, a little bit more burnt sienna heavy, I'm okay with that, because it's just going to make it look more eclectic and like proper good stone. Now this foliage on the top right is going to cast a bit of a shadow, so I'm just going to do that right under with lots of little strokes that move in this direction, and that way it implies that the sun is casting shadows from these leaves down onto the brick. Really simple work right there. We can also do it under the foliage that we have right here and right here. So now the color stretches from one side of the painting to the other, and it also works from the bottom to the top. If we move up just a little bit, we can also place it on the tops of these openings that we have sketched in, and down the left-hand sides of them too. Nice and easy. Now these are acrylics, we do need multiple layers, so I'm going to go in over all of that with a slightly brighter, slightly warmer mix. It won't be as bright or as warm as it is on the palette, because acrylics are semi-transparent and will have the cooler undertones, but it'll make it a bit more complex, and I really like the texture it'll create. Now I do want this to be fairly dry before we go back in, and as I apply it, I'm going this more scratchy look. So I'm not applying too much of the pigment, just enough that we start to impact it, but it's not holistic. If you go ahead and you look a lot closer, and we will soon, you'll see that we have streaks, we have a lot of the grain of the canvas showing through, and it's just building that stony texture that we love. So again, close up, here you can see it's a soft application. You can see the darker pigment, the cooler pigment underneath it to a point, and this is what's going to give us something much more interesting than just a solid color. So yet again, here we are. Top right hand side, very little pressure with the brush. You can see that I'm going over a lot of my negative space too. It's okay if the white of the canvas adopts a little bit of this warm, cool gray. From there, we'll start rendering the base layer for the areas in which sun is actually hitting, and that is a lot of our Naples yellow, titanium white, just a hint of our burnt sienna, and a hint of our Mars black. We can also throw in a little bit of green gold just to make it, again, nice and cohesive. So now we're going to head in and apply this. And I'd like to make a note of the fact that this is a great base to make the painting look realistic later on, but right now I am fully aware that it does not. And that's okay. While you're doing this, I don't want you to feel discouraged or like you hindered your painting in this process. It's one of those things where with acrylics, you have to take it through some awkward foundational stages to get to what you really want. And this just happens to be one of them. So trust the process, trust yourself. You saw what this looks like at the start of the video, so you know it turns out. Just don't get discouraged when it looks a little simple, a little blocky, because we do get to what we want. It just takes a little while. So with that, I'm going to continue applying this, just blocking in that base layer so that we can add some actually very aesthetic brick and whatnot. So, as an update, as I continued painting, I realized that I would actually do this portion a little bit differently had I had the opportunity to do it again, and I do fix it later in the lesson, but to save you time, I just recommend not painting the left-hand side of this wall with the darker, more burnt sienna heavy mix. Paint it more like the right-hand side or the base of the brick. So essentially just keep all of it in that much brighter hue and value, and it'll make your life easier in the future of the painting. Again, right now it looks awkward, it looks blocky, it also looks the way it's meant to. So we're going to let this dry, and then we'll head in with some base layers for actual brick and build some really neat form. I'm also going to go towards the middle bottom portion of these shadows, and I'm just going to tap in some highlights because there are going to be openings in the foliage above that are casting the shadow here on the wall, and I want those to be represented as well. So we're just going to do a couple of these. It's almost like a bokeh effect in photography. Somewhat randomized, blurred application, but we don't need too much, just enough to show that there's light working its way onto these bricks to a point. There we go. Now we'll mix our first brick pigment. We just did the pieces in between the bricks. This is the actual brick, and it's a lot of Mars black, cerulean blue, hint of our green gold, hint of titanium white. We want something that can be a little bit darker because we do want to interject shadow details in here, but I think this is a great first pigment. For the application, we'll be using the smaller flat-headed brush because it can cut nice sharp edges and carry a decent amount of paint. So I am going to go in and freestyle these bricks, though again we did have the drawing up there if you want to just recopy them the way they were exactly. That said, I'm going to try to press a good amount of pigment into the canvas, as you can see, and then I just work the edges. These are old bricks, they don't have to be perfect, but something I am really trying to do in this process is make it so that the rivers between them, in the same way rivers between sentences, don't continuously align. I want there to be a lot of diversity there. So some of these are going to be a lot stumpier, some are going to be much more elongated, and it's that variety which will make them look great. So here, as you can see, I'm also still going to continue to work atop the white open areas of canvas that will eventually, inevitably, just be foliage. So we're not too concerned about recovering that up later. We just want to make sure that we have a good thick application for all of this brickwork. I will be avoiding the highlighted areas because we wanted to do that with a different pigment. But for now, I think this is working quite nicely. And again, rebuilding that form we lost in the last step. So now we're back with another little voiceover because we are painting quite a few bricks and it does all require a very similar process. That said, some bricks I am going to make a little bit more burnt sienna heavy, some a little more cerulean blue heavy. This will just add some, again, diversity. That's really what we're looking for in these bricks. And I'm going to miss the areas where there are highlights. I'm going to apply it over to the other side and we're just going to fill it out till we have a good base. Which again, this is a base. We're doing more to these bricks. We're going to add a lot of detail, really liven them up. So that's coming in the very next step. Now for our next step, we're going to render a very similar value, a very similar hue. We're just going to make it slightly more blue, so a little bit more cool for our shadows. And maybe just a hint darker, but if we do, it's not by much at all. Now we'll switch back over to the dry flat-headed brush. So from there, we go in with that same flat-headed brush and we'll just start tapping on texture to each and every one of our bricks. It's not our final layer of texture, but it is going to start making a difference. We will inevitably get it over the pieces that bridge our brick. And that's okay, we can always go back and paint those, make them more gray, more layers, better acrylic paintings. But I'll get you a bit closer so you can really see the details. Here, again, nice and close, just using small portions of my brush to tap on some unique intricacies into all of these beautiful soon-to-be bricks. Hopefully you can also tell at this distance that some of these are a bit more brown, some are a bit more blue. So despite the fact that they're in shadow and they share a common value, the hues can vary in a way that's quite nice and unique. Now we'll create some highlights for those shadows. We still want them to be dark. So despite the titanium white and the cerulean blue, we still have a lot of Mars black. And we're also going to incorporate some burnt sienna so that it's a warmer, more complex blue, a bit more earthy. Though this is brighter than anything we've previously used. Now for the application, you already guessed it, we're going in with the fan brush, as it just has such nice detail. And the applications right here are going to look pretty sporadic. They too will look a bit messy at this point, that's okay. We're going to go in with a different brush right after and clean a lot of it up. Amalgamate applications, but this is just about getting some good randomization in the mix. Now it's also worth noting that while we are using the fan brush, it is currently fully dry, so the bristles aren't combining. Instead, we have something that's making just so many markings so quickly. Some of these bricks I'm applying more pressure than others, that way some applications are just bigger than others. I really want a lot of diversity, and that's really the only goal with these taps. Some big, some small. Now while you do this, it's easy to kind of simply make these horizontal taps. Do try to go in with some different diagonal approaches. That's just going to add a lot of unique applications and line work. You can also do little crossovers. Just make sure that it's constantly evolving. Now we'll switch back to the liner for some very intentional detail work. So now we'll go in and we'll start combining some of those highlights. I like to do a lot, as you can see, that are kind of towards the tops of our brick, as that area will get the most light and it'll combine some of these taps. Though I'm also doing additional taps with this gray as well. And this is where we instigate a little bit more structure, intentionality. I still want that darker base layer showing through, but we definitely incorporate significantly more light through this. As you can see, we've already established a lot of these pre-existing lines and shapes. So now we're just figuring out the ones that will look best together. Often it is these top ones and then a couple towards the bottom. But I also like to, because the light's going this way, do a bit of a highlight on the left edge. And it's not on all of them, but it's on enough, and I'm leaving a little bit of that darker top and a little bit of that darker edge in between the highlights and the rest of the brick. So it goes dark, highlight, dark, dark, highlight, dark. For a lot. Not all, but a lot. Then we can again really lighten some of these up. Now we'll make a slightly darker version of that mix. If not much darker, I want something that'll act as a shadow for the sides of the bricks that aren't receiving light. And this actually looks pretty great despite how dark it did turn out. Now, because the light's coming from the top and the left, we're going to apply the shadow to the right-hand side and the bottoms of these bricks. It doesn't have to be a perfect application, it can be a little bit spotty. You can jump around with the brush here and there, but for the most part we are framing them and ensuring that they're a bit more three-dimensional through this application. So as I took a step back, I did feel like they were a little bit more structured than I intended. So as I continue forward, I'm going to do more of a tapping rather than an elongated line. I think we'll get a similar effect, but just something a little bit more subtle. It'll still give us our dimension, but there we go. I like that a lot more. Little taps, little drags. If I do too much, I might do a little finger painting and just soften it here and there, but we can also go back in with our lighter grays and break it up should we need to. It's acrylics, it's forgiving, and it's really the best part of the medium. So, as an update, I was looking at the reference photo and I realized that portion that we painted on the painting towards the right-hand side, initially I thought it was a wall that went like this and then like that. It isn't. It's a singular wall that goes like this. So the values aren't correct. And this is just a time lapse of me going back and fixing that. Again, we talked about this a little bit earlier. If you want to make it easier on yourself, just paint the entirety of that wall with that lighter, almost cream color, and just make it a nice thick layer. From there, you'll be in a really good spot for the next step. And here, I'm just doing a little course correcting, which again, with acrylics, is fine. The medium was really built for it, and just exploring in general. And now it's time to work on the bricks in the sunlight. For said bricks, we are going to render a much darker mix than this, starting with our burnt sienna, our Mars black, hint of our titanium white to desaturate it, but I do want this to be a darker, rich hue to begin with. Hint of Naples yellow as well. So, we'll go back in with our smaller flat-headed brush, and this is something that will now meet all of those cool hues for the brick above. This will be a continuation of that brick. But then as we move down, we're going to start to get new, unique, and ornate ones as well. This pigment allows the bottom pigment to bleed well into it, which is nice. You can see that lighter Naples yellow underneath, and it's working to complement it. You can see that I'm also occasionally combining brick, not intentional, but easy to remedy through an additional layer of that almost Naples yellow base. And we're trying to make the bricks the same size as the ones that we did on the other side. Just different shapes and rivers. There we go. Now I'm going back over them because, as you can see, very semi-transparent, but this mix is just a bit more Mars Black and Titanium White. It's going to make it significantly more opaque so we can't see through it. It's also going to desaturate it to a point. So here, as you can see, we can just continue working our way down. Sometimes I like to draw the edges. Sometimes I like to press the side of the brush in to make bricks. And this brush is actually kind of the perfect size to do exactly that. You can see how we're just rendering a lot of unique movements. This kind of moves up and then back down, and they fit together in a pretty cohesive way. This is our first application of these ones, so there'll need to be a second, of course, but I think it already looks pretty great. Now we'll head on over to the left-hand side, and I'll continue the bricks that were caught in light. So these are the same as what we have there. They're just continued to the edge. I'm going to leave the Naples yellow mix in the areas that are in between our bricks. But I really love these just spots of light on the other side. I think it's a great look. Now, stepping back, I let this fully dry to the touch, and I want it to be a bit more textured, to have more of that canvas tooth to it. So I'm going to grab a little bit of our Naples yellow, maybe a hint of our burnt sienna. I'll make a very watery mix here with my brush to the point where it's almost like a watercolor. Then, to instill a bit of texture, I'm going to move my brush over my pre-existing bricks. I'll also do some taps. We are going to eventually lose detail to a point, but that's okay because we don't need it to be that stark anyway, and we can go back and reinstill the highlights in between. This is just going to make things a bit more unique and fun before we start actually building on the highlights. And from there, we'll start working on our first highlight for the bricks using our titanium white, Naples yellow, burnt sienna, hint of Mars black. And we want something not dramatically brighter than this, but definitely brighter, definitely a little bit more saturated. We can also make a second mix beside it with a hint of our cerulean blue. That way we just have some diversity in our highlights. So I'll start by grabbing some of the warmer initial mix of highlights, and I'll just tap those onto a couple of our bricks here. Going to occasionally jump from brick to brick for the sake of leaving others open to be a bit more blue. Just have a different palette. You could even use a green if you wanted, but it's nice and easy. Now grab more of that blue mix we just did, and I'll work that over a good number of our bricks as well. We can introduce it into the bricks we just did if we want to further add complexity to them, but you don't have to. I'll start working my way back down. Now we'll just head into these bottom ones, give them a fair amount of taps. Though, as you can see, in between our bricks, we have lost some of the fissures. So I'm going to go in and reinstill those before we're done our bricks. Just know that that is a step to come, and it's okay if the areas in between get a little messy. So from here, we're just going to let that dry and then head back in with a slightly brighter highlight. This is going to continue to add those speckles and detail to our brick. The more layers of this, honestly, the better it's going to look. And as long as we don't make it too bright too early, we can really just kind of continue to add them and build. Though, as I do this, I do look over on the left-hand side to the shadow, and I do think about maybe going back and adding a bit more layering there. It's one of those things where if you have the time and the patience, it just gets better and better. That said, once we do finish all of our brickwork, I am going to go and start applying additional highlights to the grout using the smaller flat-headed brush. This is really going to, I think, add a lot of stark contrast to this area. It's really easy. A lot of it's done in just a tap, maybe a drag, but you do want it to be quite thick. So you don't want to drag it too much, as that can really thin the pigment. Though, if you do that, you can always just go back and add another layer. That said, I do think it's adding the structure back into it. When you do all of the taps with the fan brush, we can lose the structure sometimes, but I think this is something that really fortifies the brick and makes it look quite strong. So I like this a lot, and I think together in real time, you and I are going to do the re-highlighted areas of the grout in the shadow portions. So let's do that. Now we want this to be essentially our brightest highlight in those shadowy bricks. So I'm mixing this right beside all of my other blues, and we're just going to add in more titanium white than we have previously. I'm also mixing a good amount of it because there is a good amount of space, and of course we add a hint of burnt sienna to liven it up, make it earthy. So, as you just saw with the past little speed up, I'm going and re-entering these spaces that have become a little bit complicated, a little bit messy, and we're re-interjecting some structure and some light into them. This is going to add further contrast, but also just clean up our painting. I will be working around these highlights because I don't want them to interfere with each other. They should work in a cohesive way. You can also round some of the edges around the bricks. They don't all have to be perfectly sharp and in tune. I think the character added as they round and get more unique is actually quite beneficial to the final painting. We have so much structure that we want areas that feel a bit more playful, and this is exactly how we do it. There we go. Always cathartic to get the long stretches. And just like that, a couple more thickening applications, and we are just about done our brick. I think it's looking quite lovely. All right, now we could continue on the bricks or the door, but I actually really want to start working on the foliage again, and we'll kind of bounce back and forth between the two until everything really just comes together. Now we're going to mix 2 different mixes at the same time, so we can do a wet into wet blend. Now, mix number 1 here is going to be a lot darker, so we're using significantly more Mars Black, still a hint of titanium white, but it's very dark, shadowy pigment. Mix number 2 is going to have a little bit of Mars Black, but it's more of a mid-value green. So we have significantly more green gold, a little bit more of that titanium white. It's not going to be that bright, but we still want it to be bright enough. Now, for our first wet into wet blend, I'm going to apply the shadows for our foliage right atop our bricks, leaving a good amount of space, as you can see, for our mid values and our highlights. I'll be pretty loose with how I tap this back and forth. That way there are little openings for more mid values. I'll wipe off the excess. I'll grab that mid value green. I'll apply it right on top. I'm not mixing it yet with that darker pigment. I'm just getting it loaded up like so. And then I'll start moving down into the negative spaces with lots of taps using the corner of my brush. This is going to give us a more loose, flowing application. And I really like how rich a lot of the pigments end up through this. There we go. Now switch to the smaller flat-headed brush for some details. Now, we're painting individual leaves at this point, so this brush is great because we're able to create all of these unique little draping areas which look great on top of the detailed brick. This is what's creating a lot of the shadows on the right-hand side, but it's also creating some leading lines on the left that push the eye towards the door. And then we're going to start bringing that pigment back up into the greenery, reintroducing little openings and keeping things higher contrast because we're closer to the foreground, and the closer we get to the foreground, the higher contrast you have because we have less reflective atmospheric light in the piece. So we're just separating some of those highlights, starting to carve out individual little leaves, both with shadows and our mid-value greens. And we're just prepping it for the soon-to-be highlights. So, as we step back, I think we can see that it's working quite nicely as a whole. And a lot of us are going to want to add in highlights to the top of this in the same way that we did here. We are going to do that, but we're not going to do that just yet. Instead, we are going to continue to carve out the base layer. This is essentially a base layer. Here, here, and then we'll add the highlights to all of it so that it's nice and cohesive. So let's head into this area and have some fun. Now we have these areas to signify shadows, which we wanted on the brick. So I'm going to start with the shadow color and just apply that over top those with a bit of a tapping motion. This is going to be on both sides up here. We don't have to be too careful with it. We can have it overlap, and if we lose it completely, that's okay. We can always re-interject these things should we want to. But I do want a little bit of the actual warmer pigment to show through as well. And I'm applying all of this on the right-hand side, as you can see. However, we are now going to switch to more of that highlight, more of a mid-value, but highlight in relation to what we have currently. We'll apply that on the left-hand side of it through these same taps. We get this great draping effect already, and then we can work that into our other foliage, the darker portions, and just kind of go back and forth with the two. You can see that we're building a lot of texture with this technique, the wet into wet. We're using an abundance of paint. This is literally sticking off the canvas and protruding, which is nice. Acrylic does dry about 1/3 smaller than when you apply it, but some of it might still stay. And if it does, that's some nice added depth to our painting, which we weren't expecting, but we'll happily take. Now we'll just continue heading downwards, and I do want some greenery in between this wall and this wall, so we'll just sporadically tap that here and there. We can continue to work down from our previously established portions, and again, this is just a base layer. This is all going to look a lot better once we go in with some definitive brushes, some highlights. But as far as base layers go, I'm really happy with how this is turning out right now. So we'll just continue to play, and I think, again, we want some real openings there. We'll go to the bottom, we'll apply some of this, we'll leave this predominantly open, highlights towards the top with little taps of the corner of the brush, leaving little openings just like that. Darker pigments towards the bottom, lots of similar taps, and then we'll layer grass over a lot of this as well. So again, giving you a little bit of a wider shot, I think this came together quite nicely. We have all of our highlights on the left-hand side of the strands, and then we progressively get darker. So it's highlight, dark, highlight, dark, highlight. You get to do this highlight, and then it gets darker on the other side. I also wanted to note that all of the foliage that we're doing here could be done in the same way we did the trees. This is just a different way of going about it. You can paint really every subject in 100 different ways. It's about finding what's comfortable for you. So now heading over to the left-hand side, we have these interesting areas which drop down around our brick. And you can tell right now my brush has both the dark and the light pigment on it. I'm just kind of going in with a bit of a mix, and then I'll add the darker pigments into it, and I'll add the brighter pigments as well. Though I do want this left-hand side where we're touching the edge of the canvas to be a bit darker. That way we can render a nice vignette effect in the painting. And then we'll go back for the greens. We'll apply those on the top as we did here, and we'll start to bring them down through various little textured taps, really using the corner of the larger flat-headed brush. And this is all wet into wet, so we have to be pretty quick. This is a top area, so we're going to do a bit more of that highlight, but then we'll quickly work it into the shadow. Looking good. It's looking good. I'll just move that down. And we'll continue using that darker value to get the bottom of this green foliage. The farther down, the more dark it's going to be, the more shadow we're going to have. And this is going to look a little bit flat until we have the bushes and the nice foliage on top. But we'll start like that, then we'll grab some of our highlights, reintroduce those around the edges, and because we have so much dark paint, this will dissipate really quickly and it won't look too bright, don't you worry. The more you mix it, the more you work it in, the darker it'll get, because the base layer is dark and it'll just keep thinning itself and adopting more of those darker values. Now I'm switching back over to the smaller flat-headed brush, and this is to do exactly what we did in the top, and that's break apart some of the areas that feel a little bit too either dark or light and create that variance. We can also just create some individual strands that kind of poke out and make things a bit more unique. I want to switch to the liner brush to really start on that, but for now this is good. I'm also going to line a little bit of this green, as you can see, horizontally over some of our brick, as that'll make it a lot more unique and so diverse. And now that nice green highlight on the tops of all of those darker applications. Doing it via a tap, not a drag, because we still want that nice texture that we've been attempting to instill. And I'm doing it through multiple layers and applications. I can also re-interject it into the little guys that were falling and protruding. So we're doing a lot of different things all at the same time because the pigment's wet. We kind of have to move quickly and play. So from there, we are going to work on our highlights, which means a lot of titanium white, little bit of green gold, little bit of Naples yellow, but this is going to be significantly brighter than that which we've mixed before. And as for brushes, we will go in with the damp fan brush, so we have the forked application. So we'll begin our application on top of our previous mid values. I'm going to essentially create a bit of a line that'll trace the top. And then once I have something that, for the most part, covers the areas we want, we'll grab some of it and we'll just start working our way into our previous applications. Have that light trickling down and over. I'm rotating my brush in the air, and we're just getting some beautiful highlights to stream down. Though, if you do feel like this is a little bit too stark, don't worry. We can always go back to our mid values here on the palette, and we can interject those both beside and over top our highlights. So now we have, again, a bit of a wet and a wet blend going on. So now we'll head back on up here. And with this, I'm not just doing a tap, I'm doing a little bit of a drag. So it's a tap and a drag, a tap and a drag. And this is going to create, again, that feeling of foliage falling. I'm only applying it over the previously highlighted areas, the areas that we interjected a lot of mid values into. And I'm placing it on the left-hand side of those. That way it looks like the light's coming in, we get highlight, we get mid-value, and then we get shadow through all of those interesting and unique protrusions. And you can see how it also almost waterfalls down into this area. So it's all starting to work together, very cohesive way. Don't want to do too much, but just enough. So now we'll head down this area, and we are going to be next to this lighter, almost brick color, similar to that of the mortar, the grout. And we want it directly on top of that, and then we go slightly back into here. Though this is a fairly dark area, and I do think we should grab some mid value to go right behind it. That way we have a more subtle transition. It's a little bit less dramatic, and we can also do little taps over portions of that highlighted section just to make it feel a little more natural. Down here I'm doing more of the mid values than I am the highlights, but there's a bit mixed in. Also, here's just a little bit of that greenery. growing on the sides of our brick. Because we have so much of it adjacent to the brick, it only makes sense that it'll also find a home on it as well. And we're just re-interjecting some mid-values where we feel they could be used. Everything here is dry now, so we're now painting wet into dry, and we can get some sharper, more intentional detail should we want to. So now we're going to head back in. I'm on the left-hand side, and I'm going to apply some highlight. As you can see, in the area that's right next to the highlighted brick. This area has sunlight coming in. It's going to be a lot brighter. However, the areas around it, not so much. So we're going to leave this area. We're going to assume that there's another opening of light maybe through here. And that's really the only places this true highlight is going to be, on the left-hand side. We just want it where there might be openings. I mean, we can assume that there are openings wherever we'd like. There can be openings in this hypothetical tree, but for the most part, the highlight's going to stay on the top and on the right-hand side. Now, because we're not doing so many of those actual highlights, we're going to go in with more of our mid-values and that fan brush. That way we create significantly more markings and taps in a similar nature. We're building on those patterns without building on those highlights. And that's going to be enough to make this area also look pretty cohesive. Now we'll switch to the liner for some more intentional details. So with this, I'm going to be doing a lot of protrusions and building up this highlight area to be a bit taller than it currently is. This area at the top does have some real light on it, and I want that to show through. That said, as we start to move downwards, I'm actually going to mix my mid value with my highlight. That way we can have a transitionary portion where it's not too bright, it's not too dark, but it moves you from one pigment to the next. And I'm going to apply this predominantly over previously highlighted or mid value applications. Also, we applied our highlights, the openings, with the fan brush, which is great for getting those randomized applications. We really want that, so it has a very real look to it. We don't want it to look too manufactured. But once we have those larger applications in there, then we switch to the liner and we refine these areas, making sure that they are still working within our composition, that highlights are layered properly, and we have these nice draping spots, which also with highlight look a lot better. So we can just imagine that the light streams in here a little bit too. Not too much, but we can always also add highlights back to the brick should we need to. Let's head up just a bit. There we go. Just breaking these parts up a little bit. When it gets too congested with either a highlight or a shadow, we just do a little bit more of the other. Now we need to build an even brighter highlight with a lot of titanium white, Naples yellow, and just a hint this time of our green gold. Now with the liner brush, we're going to find the edge where this foreground meets the background, and we'll tap on some very intentional details, which, as you can see, are brighter than anything else we've had. Also, I start on the edge, as one does, but I will work my way in and apply a couple of these subtle taps with slightly less pressure to the areas right behind. That way, it looks like the light is streaming in a much more natural way. It's not just an outline. I think this area got a little ambiguous between here and here, so we have an opportunity to differentiate our varying subjects. And I love how clean and sharp this makes it all. Despite the fact that we have so many taps and so many textures, we have definitive subjects again. And this is why acrylic painting just takes patience. It's a lot of layering to get to this point, but when you do, you just feel so good by watching it come together. So cathartic. I think this area also got a little bit muddy in the transition. So another great opportunity to differentiate foreground from background. It's also worth noting I'm going in with a lot of thick pigment. It's not too watery, and that way we get something dramatically opaque. And now, once we have that top area, we'll start to bring it down just a little bit. Tapping on top of the already pre-existing highlights and just expanding upon them to be a little bit brighter as we progressively move down. And as we do move down, we will run out of pigment, so our taps will be less bright, less opaque, and we'll have a good natural transition into the darker, more shadow-heavy base. Now we'll also move down just a little bit because these areas, which present themselves beside and on top of this warmer, more rocky area, are also going to have some of that. And it's going to tie that top area of the painting in with more of the bottom area. We don't want too much of it, but just enough. And then we'll take some of that and we'll also work it on top of our highlighted green brick areas. And this will actually tie it in so beautifully. All of it doesn't need the same level of highlight. We still want the darker greens on the bricks, but these are really going to help tie it in. I would also like to note that while this is bright, it's the brightest value we've interjected thus far, it's not the brightest value we will interject. We're still going to go slightly brighter to continue to differentiate these subjects. So leave just a little bit of room in your mix for a more titanium white heavy application. Just going back and making sure a lot of these applications are thick enough. And from there, yet again, we will go even brighter, more titanium white, more of our green gold, and this is the final highlight for our greens, the brightest to be achieved. And yet again, I'm going to start applying this in this corner. I feel like it's just a really nice transitional area. We can go higher, we can go lower, but we are just applying this to the edge and the most rare tap on the inside for cohesion's sake. As we move up towards the sky, it'll almost match it in value and get lost. And that's really beautiful. Now, as we do this, it's important that we do leave openings between some of these highlights. That way it doesn't look like just a pure line across. In painting, we never really want to outline things, at least not in the final variant of it. So skipping a little area, I'm skipping a little area, and we're building it up progressively. There we go. And again, slightly atop previous highlights. I won't do too many over here because I want it to be a bit more vignetted. So we'll leave that a bit more open. Now we're going to start working on the bottom portion of the painting in our little walkway. The highlighted areas are going to have a lot of burnt sienna, Naples yellow, titanium white, and of course a hint of our Mars black, just like that. Make sure it's nice and saturated. And for our second color, we'll grab some of our cerulean blue, a little bit of our Mars black, titanium white, and again, a lot of burnt sienna because this is going to be the shadow portion of that same sand. So starting off, I'm going to apply that darker, more shadowy mixture to the ground over here on the left-hand side, and I'll kind of trail the edge, then I'll let it expand. I'm rotating my brush so that I get some unique movements, but we do let it run out as we get towards that middle point, at which point I am going to switch pigments. Now we'll grab the highlight we just mixed. I'll put that over on the other side, again trailing the right, dropping the liner brush in the process. It's okay, we're not using the liner brush for this. And I'll just work this over into the shadowed hues. You can see that we have some soft transitions, which is really nice. It looks like the shadows are working their way this way, but they're not too prominent. And we're getting some good texture. I'm also softly mixing all of the edges, so applying very little pressure in between the two. And that's just going to give us something that feels a bit more subtle. Then we can do a little bit of that darker hue over here, just in case there's, you know, portions of shadow that also cast through the sand. But it's a really easy application, wet into wet, and you want it to look pretty rough and unique. Now we'll go in and just do a bit of a second layer, make sure that it's nice and thick through all of the areas that it needs to be. And I might, on my palette, just make a slightly brighter version of our highlight. Work that in that bottom right hand corner where we'll have the most light, and then have that progressively work up. It's just an added value and hue to further make this a bit more interesting. Do a little bit of finger painting too. There we go. If your applications get a little chalky, that's okay, as it will just look like more textured sand and dirt. Now, in that darker mix, we'll just add a bit of Mars Black, and in another area of it, we'll add more Titanium White. These are two good colors for little rocks. Now, with our liner brush, we'll just go in and we'll do lots of little taps for various rocks. More along the edge than towards the center, just because in a realistic scenario, these would be cleared from the center, just from people walking, and you know, they'd be pressed more into the ground. So we'll have little ones and hints of that texture, but for the most part, this is towards the side, where I will apply slightly more pressure with my brush to get a larger impression. Though in the middle, while we do have impressions, they're very soft. Towards the edge, harder for bigger. And we'll just do a lot of these. Like that. And then we'll go and we'll apply some highlights to the tops of these. So in some areas it's a tap and a drag, in some it's just a tap, but we also don't have to do it to all of them, because realistically some of these will be different types of rocks which will have different sheens. This is just a way of adding dimension. You can make some of the values a little brighter or darker, but cumulatively this will make for a nice little detail, makes them less dark. And we'll do hints in the shadow, but I think for the shadow area we'll make that highlight just a little bit darker, and that's perfect because it won't get the same highlight, but it will have volume and mass just like that. And now we'll add a real highlight for the sand using more Titanium White, Naples Yellow, and Burnt Sienna in that highlight mix. You can see it's brighter, but not dramatically so. And then, in the same way we did the rocks, little taps of highlight throughout the brighter portions, for the most part, of sand. So it's a accumulation of a wet into wet blend, shadows in the dark areas, rocks, big and small, and then just taps of highlight and potential rock. As I get closer to us, my taps will get a little bit bigger, just because perspective will make the shines and the rocks and all of that appear a little bit brighter. And occasionally we can just do a couple little speckled highlights in here. They'll actually be a bit darker than over here because acrylics are semi-transparent and that darker hue will show through. But just like that, we have a lot of additional detail. Looking nice and sharp. Actually, you know what? I think we're going to work on the bricks that are right next to the pathway first, and then we'll do the foliage. For said brick, we are going to remix essentially what we had there with the cerulean blue, the burnt sienna, the more shadow pigment. Now the actual application process of this is unbelievably easy. We're just going to cut the silhouettes in for a couple of our rocks. You can see they're going to protrude out over the now painted ground. And then we'll just cut some tops, some sharper angles for those areas into it. Large flathead brush is great for this because it does carry so much paint, but it also has such a nice sharp edge. There we go. Now from there, while that starts drying, we'll mix up our highlight for it, which is very much akin to the key highlights we used for our brick. And just like that, I think we have something fairly nice. Let's dab in a little bit of our cerulean blue because it's still in a shadowy area, but it is a bright part of the rock. Now we'll switch on over to the smaller flat-headed brush for some real detail work. With said highlighted pigment, I'm going to apply this initially towards the tops of these rocks, but I'm leaving little openings for the divots in the areas that kind of move inwards. This is still an area that is, for the most part, cast in shadow, though we will carry some of those highlights down, and we'll do little taps with the corner of our brush to make these applications a bit more unique and intricate. Right now though, we are just focusing on the tops of them, like so. And then we'll move down here, and we'll get the top of this guy. So they also look like more rectangular bricks as a whole. It works with the larger ones that we've previously presented in our painting. This is a great start. You also have a lot of foliage on top, so if they're not perfect, that's okay. This is just a nice little subtle detail for those who really do a deep dive into looking into the painting. Now we'll make a second highlight, which is a little bit more burnt sienna and titanium white heavy within the previous one. So it's close, but it's a little warmer and a little brighter. Now with the liner brush, we're going to go back in and we can just tap on some slight little highlights that might be akin to what we have over here, but on our rock. And as I run out of paint, it'll get more and more thin, so I can use it almost everywhere and it'll still look like a shadow pigment, but the first application, when we still have a lot of paint on our brush, can look like that beautiful warmth and help tie it all together. Though we're only going to do this on the tops of our rocks because it's far too bright for this side, which is opposite to the light and therefore significantly darker. From there, I'll grab just a hint of titanium white, work that into our darker shadow mixture, and we use this as a glaze, just to add a little bit of texture to our shadows. Now in here, again, it's very watery, so I'm just going to be a little bit scratchy, but create some vertical lines to move down our bricks, like that. Do little circles here and there, but because it's almost all the same value and just a little bit more watery, we're building minute amounts of texture without really changing much of the volumes or structures. And I think that's actually enough. Again, we're going to have a lot of foliage over this. And from there, we are going to finally switch to the greenery on the right and the left-hand side. Now, for the base layer of said greenery, we will start with our green gold, an abundance of our Mars black, and we do need a lot of this pigment, then a hint of our Naples yellow, and titanium white, just so it's not too dark, and we do retain the nice green hues in it. As for our application, we are going to stick with the larger flat-headed brush because It does have a lot of pigment on it. It can move a lot of pigment, and as you can see, within seconds, we are going to cover the needed area. That said, I do want this to be a lot of taller, aggressive, kind of protruding grass, so I am going to make some elongated, sharper movements towards the top. It's a little different than what we've done. Have them crisscross. We want them to be as small as possible, so do try to use a damp brush. And then we'll also do some that overlap the other side here. Just like that. And we can refine with the liner brush. And again, while that brush is great for applying a lot of pigment and getting the sharp edges, the liner is great for very intentional mark making, and that's what we want to do at the ends of the strokes we just made. So we're switching our brush, and we're committing to something a bit more fine. Really beautiful how it overlaps the ground and creates something very depth heavy in the end here. Make sure that your liner brush is nice and small, nice and damp, and you'll get some great markings. Again, if you need a new one, you can find my brush set in the video description, and you can work with the exact same one. And from there, we're back to the larger flat-headed brush, because we do have a lot of open canvas on the left-hand side here. I'm just going back and forth with a bit of a crisscross X-shaped tap to fill in the top area here. We do want a lot of this grass and foliage to protrude over our brick, but we don't want to go too high because we can do so with a more intentional brush later on. We're just kind of getting the stage set here. And then I'll move on down. Initially, cut around the brick that we had, that we are going to layer on top of it. And we'll just finish off this little section. Now we'll switch to the liner just like we did last time. And rather than doing a tall grass, I'm actually going to do a bit of a tap, similar to what we did for our foliage up above, because I want this to be more of a leafy plant than a grass. It's just going to make it a bit more diverse. It's what I saw in the reference photo, and I thought it was a great idea. We can also have taller grass in here as well, but I do think this is a great way forward, and it'll bridge the texture of this into this bottom portion. Now we'll just do the same over on top of a lot of our brick. So still using that same liner brush, that same idea. We can have it kind of fall in between our stones down here as well. And then it can kind of come out into the ground area. So we're really just expanding, letting it naturally find its way out into the open and create less harsh transitions between subjects. It was much more natural. There we go. Now we need a mid value. So a lot more of that green gold, little bit of our Naples yellow, Mars black, but not as much as before. And already I think we have a great pigment to build with. Now, once this is dry to the touch, we are going to go in with our damp fan brush. And as you can see, while we used to be making markings with a fan brush vertically, I'm going to be making them more so horizontally for a lot of these leafy applications. It's just going to make things a bit more round in volume, so it doesn't look like it's falling, but it looks like it's kind of building on top of other applications. And we'll kind of create these edges that turn like that towards our bricks on the ground. That way it looks like our greenery has a trajectory. And I'll make them more sparse down towards the bottom because I want to interject grasses in here as well, and that requires openings, not only in the paint but in the setting as well. So more taps towards the top, less towards the bottom. Now, using a dry fan brush, so we have just a myriad of these little implications, I'm going to render some grass in the mix. So in the larger openings, I'm just doing these more elongated strokes, which occasionally crisscross. Some are taller than others. Sometimes they build out towards the left and right, but nice and simple. Diversifying our application styles. And it's all very subtle because we don't have any real highlights in it yet, but we will. Now, we'll use that same fairly dry fan brush, head over to the right-hand side, and we'll mark in some blades of grass as well. Remember, a lot of them are moving this way, so the larger stroke needs to be inwards. And we're overlapping. Now, we'll mix up a slightly brighter version because, let's be honest, we can't really see much of that on the canvas. It's just working as a framework for our next highlights, giving us a chance to try things. But this will show up, and nicely. So now that we have those rough ideas marked in with our fan brush, I'm heading back in with the liner and I'm going on top of the areas that I really liked. So we're just doubling down on that which worked. And this again is very similar to what we did up top in the painting, but now a lot of these markings, again, rather than moving vertically, are moving horizontally. Towards the edge, they're also moving in a bit of a curved motion, which eventually turns into a bit of a fall. But up here, it's more horizontal. Don't forget to leave some openings. And as we move down, we're going to start rendering a couple highlights on little grassy areas as well. Again, these have been pre-painted. You might not be able to see them anymore with the fan brush, but they kind of gave us an idea of where we could go with it. And then we also do the little taps around, and it's the combination of the multiple applications which will turn into something really pretty here in the end. There we go. As I run out of paint, I'll move into the darker areas. So this is going to be darker. I'll kind of paint around that with next to no paint. This is darker, but we're establishing that pattern. And then we can grab a little bit more of our pigment. Do these elongated grass strokes again. I like that one. I love that. And now we have that perfect water to brush consistency. Make sure that they overlap. And then we have more of those perfect little taps as well. And now we'll move more so into the foreground. As we get closer to us, the grass is going to get longer and it's also going to get a little bit bigger because perspective is just going to make it look so. Right, the farther away a subject is, the smaller it's going to look, even if it's the same size as that which we're painting right up front. So these are areas we can have a lot of fun, apply a little bit more pressure with our brush, like so. They're also not that bright because, again, remember, for the most part we are in the shadowy area, but there's a lot of room to brighten and play. So we're just keeping that open while expanding upon that which we really like. Also this left-hand side, I'm purposefully going to leave it a bit less detailed and a bit darker. That way it creates a vignette in the painting. And the eye just won't wander to the edge. It'll stay more close to the center and the door. There we go. A lot of the grass is moving inwards for the sake of leading lines towards the door. We can also make a much darker green with our watery liner brush, and we can re-interject openings into the grass if we happen to make it a little bit too full. Now, yet again, we want to build our highlights, so more Naples yellow, more green gold. It's not significantly brighter, but it really shouldn't be in this section. We're just taking incremental steps. There we go. Now we'll take that, and we'll be very intentional with applying it to the tops of our blades of grass. We don't want it on all of them. We don't want to cover the entirety of them. But the ones where we feel like they might catch a little bit more light, we just interject this brighter application, and I think it very quickly builds a lot of depth and interjects form, which we might have lost through all of the taps and layering. We can also go in and do exactly that, those little taps to the areas of foliage which we might have a bit more highlight on. So we're going to jump around, we'll move a little bit higher, and we realistically can go as bright as we did in the highlights towards the midsection, but we don't want to go there too quickly. We just want to experiment and see what areas we like it better in. And I think this is an area where it could really benefit from. And then we let it dissipate as it works its way out and around, because there'll only be so much light working through the top trees. We can have it here. Makes sense, it's next to the highlighted brick. Just like that. And I'll move back and dissipate. There we go. Now, this process is one that can take quite some time, so we're just going to run into a little time lapse here where I slowly build highlights on my favorite pieces of grass, and that means essentially creating different clusters that will have that sun coming in, creating that highlight. Surrounded, we will have other grass that is fully in shadow, and there will be a progressive gradient from the brightest points in the grass out to the darker areas. So we're really following the same ideas that we laid out in our brick, but we're doing so down here. And now I'm going to the real highlights with some extra titanium white in the mix. We just build and build, and the brightest points in the grass are the tops, and then it progressively gets a little bit darker as we slowly move down, because that really is just how the light will fall and shadows will be rendered. Now, once we're done applying our highlights over here on the left-hand side, we are going to go ahead and move over onto the right in this section right here. I'm going to begin by working over the pre-existing silhouetted blades of grass, bringing those highlights in, predominantly on the left-hand side of them, because that's the way light will be moving from. This isn't the brightest pigment. This is really akin to what we were just working with, if not the exact same mix. That way it's nice and cohesive. But once we start to establish those, then we can move inwards a little bit. This area as a whole is going to be highlighted, so this grass can be quite bright. We have a lot of room to brighten exactly this. Though I am still leaving openings, that way we have a nice contrast, because that contrast will make it look really good. Okay, and once we've moved down a little bit, I also want to make sure that we pay proper attention to the ones that are overlapping the actual ground. These are the most standout pieces of grass, so we want them to have a good amount of care and detail. Going to go back, grab more pigment, grab more water, try to make the smallest impressions possible, and just transition these into the rest of what we just did. So a lot of them were moving this way, but now we have some moving downwards. And I rarely have any that are perfectly vertical. They always typically have a twist one way or another. But with the top and this, now we can kind of start to close that gap. We've essentially created a corner of grass. And this next part's really easy. We just start to move downwards, making our grass larger and larger, leaving nice big openings, and expanding the actual blades by pressing slightly harder into the canvas with our brush. Now we'll just... From there, we'll make an even brighter variant of that. So titanium white, Naples yellow into that pre-existing green, and we'll add some highlights. So from here, I'm just going to reapply this to the tops of pre-existing blades of grass. Allow them to stand out to a greater degree. And it's not a dramatic variance, but I think it's enough to create some good depth and make this feel a bit more natural. We'll do so more towards the side here, because that's where we're closer to the light. And yet again, even more highlight. It's important that the highlights on this grass are at least as bright, if not brighter, than the highlights we have on the other side. So we're just going to progressively build it up until we have grass we truly love. Trying to instigate some additional diversity in here as well, just because it's easy to kind of do the same thing over and over. And when you go back and you reapply the highlights, you have an opportunity to extend, to move, to play with a lot of this grass. That's what we're doing. We're just extending, moving, playing with, highlighting. Oh, I love that. When you get that perfect amount of water and pigment on your brush, you just feel so much confidence on the canvas. All right, now from there, we're going to work on the inner portion of the door. We're getting close. So for this, we will need some Cerulean blue, burnt sienna, Mars black. The goal here is to render a really dark shadow, much akin to the bottom shadows in our bricks that line the walkway. As for our application, I am going to stick with this brush because it does have these nice sharp edges. It's going to let me craft my way around both the top bricks, which we are yet to do, and the door, which we are yet to do. But this is a great way of just framing everything, and it'll also touch all of the brick that we have down towards the left-hand side, make that feel significantly more complete. There we go. Make sure you have a nice thick layer, or go back and do it twice. From there, I'm going to make a slightly brighter and more red variant of that using the burnt sienna and Naples yellow. This will just be a slight highlight for the bricks on the inner section with again, a hint of that cerulean blue. Perfect. Now we're back to the smaller flat-headed brush for some brickwork. So from there, we're going to actually look at our bricks, and then we're going to extend them back here just like so. That way we have that same idea, that same movement, and it looks like this is just a corner of the brick to be. Lots of little breaks in between, as you would imagine. And then we can also do that a little bit with these. They're drawn in so we can see where the edges are. We'll just paint around the edges. and we'll let it dissipate as it moves inwards towards this area, which will be darker because it'll have more shadow. But not a hard task here. Just creating a slight impression. There we go. From there, we're going to make it just a little bit brighter. Some burnt sienna and titanium white. Now, we'll go in with that new slightly brighter, warmer color, and we'll build some slight texture onto these bricks so that they feel a little more natural and three-dimensional as well. We're not doing too much. It's just a slight highlight. I'm being very randomized with my impressions. You can see I'm moving quickly for that purpose. It's hard to have control when you don't really stop. Now yet again, we'll just add a little bit of titanium white, a little bit of Naples yellow to that mix, brighten it up, and we'll head back in to the grout. And now, as you can see, we'll just start working in those pre-existing lines with our liner. We can also use a smaller flat-headed brush should you want to, but I think already this is looking really nice. There we go. Go back and do a second layer. Make sure things are thick enough. Now we're going to work on this open area of brick, and this portion is going to be more of a blue in the shadows, and then it's going to become a lot warmer through right here. So for this mix, we're going to start with a bit of our titanium white, Mars black, so we can build a good gray. Then we need some cerulean blue to make it nice and blue, but yet desaturated. Hint of our burnt sienna to make it a bit more earthy. And I think this will be great for the blue portions. Now let's mix a second color to mix it in with. Now right beside it on the palette, I'm going to mix a warmer brick color using our burnt sienna, Naples yellow, a little bit of our titanium white, and again, a little bit of our Mars black to desaturate it. These two look great together, and that's exactly what we needed for our base layers. So again, this area is in the light, and I'm going to begin putting the base layer down for these bricks, just like so. Larger flat-headed brush is allowing me to cut along these sharp edges, make a nice clean application, and then we'll switch towards the cooler hues. Now we'll head on to the other side, and we'll apply this nice dark bluish gray that we rendered. It's very much akin to what we used previously for our bricks. We just don't have any texture in it yet, though that is coming soon. Did consider painting this at the same time as the other bricks, but the orientation's a bit different, and I didn't want to overcomplicate things. I wanted it to be a bit more digestible. So we just did this a little bit later, and it's good because now we get to revisit the subject, paint it maybe a little bit differently, but also remind ourselves of how we did it, so we can do so in future paintings as well. Now here's just a little bit of a blend. Here you can just see I'm using the corner of my brush to get a good transition between the two. It's not going to be too stark, but it's also not going to be unnoticeable. Now we need a slightly darker version of that warmer mix, so I'm going to add extra Mars black and burnt sienna, so we can add in some shadows. Now with this, I'm going to start creating individual bricks by creating openings between them. As you can see, it's a lot like the grout from before, just like that. And we'll transition it into the cooler areas as well. That way we have a good continuous motion. Then I'll do lots of little taps. This works if your pigments are dry. This works if your pigments are wet. It can be wet into wet, at which point it'll be a little bit more soft. If it's wet into dry, these applications will be a bit more sharp. Neither of which are wrong. It just changes how your bricks look a little bit. Here, some of it's wet, some of it's dry, and I'm not really worried about it. I'm just having a good time applying some texture. It's a different way of painting bricks, but again, much like the foliage, how we painted it differently up top and down below, wanted to show you that there are multiple ways of going about all of this, and that you can render a beautiful painting regardless. It's just really about personal preference. There we go. Now, we'll grab some extra Naples yellow, extra titanium white, work that into our warmer mix, make something a bit brighter, and we'll add in some highlights to those same bricks. So, jumping in with this highlight, we're going to look for the areas that don't have a lot of shadow. So we just implied a lot of shadow texture. Try to go for the areas that are a little bit brighter that we avoided, and we'll build that up through there. And then we'll start combining these taps and applications into slightly larger areas. This won't be our final highlight. We will get brighter, but we do want to build progressively, and that's exactly what this technique is allowing us to do so. I'm also avoiding the areas in between. I do have a different plan for doing a good job with that, but we're going to leave it for now. And I'll let this dissipate as we move up, because here we transition into the shadows. So we can just do a tap up here or two, and that's essentially where our highlights end. Now yet again, we add additional Naples yellow into the mix, a little bit more of our titanium white, and from there we can add our real highlights. So heading back into it, we are going to apply that highlight, which, as you can see on the canvas, is a little bit darker than what it was on our palette. That's just because my brush is pretty wet, and therefore the pigment's very transparent. We're getting a lot of those darker hues and values showing through. If you want it to be as bright as it was on the palette, you just use less water on your brush, but I'm okay if it means just doing an extra layer or two in this process. Again, the more layers, the more detail, the more texture, probably the better the painting. It's often how it works. Not always, but often with realism. Okay, and because the light's moving this way, I'm just going to add a darker pigment right behind all of these bricks, just to show that there's a little bit of a lip that can't receive light. And we can even do a little bit at the bottom. This is really just that simple dark mix that we used before. Thought I'd just reincorporate it there and then do some taps on the inside to reinstigate lost values that we used to have, but the highlights kind of overwhelmed them. There we go. Now we'll add more titanium white to that pigment, and here we have something for the grout for in between the bricks. Now the application, as you know, is quite simple. We're just going to go in between. I'm going to try to leave this darker marking slightly above the grout. That way it looks like the brick itself has a slight protrusion. And the first application will probably not be bright enough, so we'll go in with a second. We'll connect it to the applications on the outside. And that should really start to bring it together. All right, now that it's looking good, we are going to head into the highlights in the shadow portion. So back to more of our blues. For our shadows, we're going to want our Cerulean blue, Mars black, titanium white, burnt sienna to make it nice and earthy, and is a little too saturated, so we'll double down on the Mars Black and Titanium White. As for our application, we are going back in with the liner brush. I'm tapping this into this first shadow portion. I think we're going to work from the right hand side to the middle, and then inevitably, eventually we'll get to the left. But you can see I'm leaving a little opening in there for the inevitable grout and whatnot. There we go. Just a good number of taps, not covering up all of the base, but enough of it. And we'll just continue to head on over. I might sometimes also create these longer limes just to create additional form. We're not always going to do that. We are going to break them up a lot. We will go back and do more layers just for the sake of building opacity, but I think just like that we have our first layer, and we can start to build some better highlights and details on top of it. Now we'll reinterject some additional titanium white, brighten it up, add a hint more of that burnt sienna just for diversity and warmth, and we'll head back in. Now again, while this area is in shadow, it will still have highlight, and these areas protrude. They catch a little bit more reflective light than the rest. I'm really bouncing my brush around in the shadows to get something unique with each application, and my brush is quite watery so that we get a variety of opacities in these applications. And with this, I'm really going to continue to try to build it up over areas that were previously highlighted, because those are going to allow this to be a bit brighter, as the base layer will be brighter, and this is semi-transparent. We will see the base layer through it, but also it's just a good guide and essentially just a rough sketch for what we want in these secondary, third, all the additional applications afterwards. I like that. I think it's going pretty well. Looking nice and clean. Now we'll make something much brighter. So same palette, but for the grout, we want more titanium white, less Mars Black, probably a similar amount of cerulean blue. So with this, as you can see with this grout, we're just going to work continuously in between our bricks, like so. And it's going to create a lot of differentiation between them, in the same way it did for the surrounding more horizontal bricks. It's a really easy application, but it very quickly brings the painting together in a way that is impactful. There we go. Maybe we have one more right here. And you can do multiple applications if you feel like you need to make it more opaque, but I'm fairly happy with it right there. There we go. We'll just continue that down into the brick below as well. We'll let it dissipate as it gets farther down. We don't want this to be too bright, so I'm just going to make it a little bit darker. But all of the layering does help. Okay, so we have a good start. Now we're going to go ahead and start adding some warmth, some highlights, and some little openings of light in all of those cool hues. Now for that sunny part of the highlight, we do need some burnt sienna, Naples yellow, a little bit of titanium white, hint of our cerulean blue, just so it's somewhat cohesive, and Mars Black to desaturate just a little bit. I think I want my first highlight in this area, just because we don't have a lot of color diversity through here, and it's such an easy way of interjecting something unique and warm Something that'll also, while unique, tie it into the rest of our piece. So it spans 3 bricks. It's predominantly in the middle one. It's a little bit on the edges. And that's a great little base. Now we'll just throw a little bit of Naples yellow into that mix and we'll head right back in. We'll apply that right on top of our previous highlight. I'm leaving portions of the first one still visible, but applying this in the more dominant areas. And I really like that. Nice and easy. We'll also fill in the grout with some highlight, just in those areas. And for said grout, we are going to double down on the titanium white in the mix, make it just a bit brighter. And now, back to the canvas. So this is nice and easy. Just reapplying it to those highlights in between. Not letting it get too high because of course the light just doesn't travel up through all of those shadows. But that looks really good. From there, we're back to our green gold and re-interjecting some of the greenery into the rock. Now, for said greens, I actually want to mix a variety of them right here. So I'm going to have a darker one over here to the left. I'll have a more titanium white and Naples yellow one over here to the right. In the middle, it's kind of this combination with the green gold. And now we have 3 we can play with on the canvas. Nice and easy, just like that. Maybe interject hints of it into this brick, that way it's nice and cohesive. Then I'll go to the slightly brighter version and I'll tap that into the areas which might receive a little bit more light, so areas that are right next to the highlights, but also in the centers and areas that might protrude. And then we'll go to the absolute highlight for the areas that are again right on that light. Creates a transition into the green. And I think that's simple, yet beautiful. So here we're taking a step back, looking at it as a whole, making sure that things work together cohesively, and I really love it. I think that we have a lot of great details and unique intricacies. I like how we move from the cool kind of shadows to the warmer sun-soaked areas, and at this point, I'm quite happy with the painting as a whole. So we're going to jump into that doorway and start working with some brand new textures. So the next step is really to go in here and block in these larger portions of the door with a mid value, and then what are shadows and then what are highlights. Now for that mid value, we start with burnt sienna. We do want some of our Naples yellow, that'll thicken it, it'll desaturate it. Mars black will bring it down a little bit in value. Titanium white will desaturate but keep it thick, and I think I just want a hint more warmth, and that's a great initial mid value. So as for application, I'm actually going to stick with this larger flat-headed brush. I'm just going to craft a nice sharp rounded top using the corner of the brush. We'll overlap little bits of our brick. That's okay. If we expand it too much, we can paint our brick back. I'll work horizontally around these separating pieces for now, just so we know where they are in a little bit's time. And we'll continue blocking in this nice midsection. I want it to be thick. So if it's not, we're doing multiple layers. That's okay. And now as we continue downwards, I'm going to fill in this next section of the door. We have this giant iron piece that kind of cuts it in half. We'll paint that with a different value and hue, but for now, we just work around it. It's also worth noting that all of the little slits in between the boards and the door, we will come back to those, and we'll do those a little bit later as well. We're just going to break it up so that it's nice and digestible. Doesn't feel intimidating or too much at any point. Here we're just changing the orientation of our brush so that we can get a nice sharp line around our edges. Nice and easy, nice and clean. Then we can go back to using the larger body of the brush to work in more of the open space. It's also worth noting that when you need that clean line, apply less pressure so that you don't expand the brush's bristles. And then when you want to fill in a large area, that's when we really press with our brush. We can repaint the grass over it too. This is just fine. Now, once our door is fully dry to the touch, we are going to head into our next mix. We're going to take our previous color and we're just going to add a little bit of Mars Black into it. That way we have a good shadow pigment for all of the inserted grain in the wood. And with that, we'll switch to our dry fan brush. I'm going to leave about 2 millimeters between the top of the board and where I'm going to start applying paint, because I want there to be a little rounded board that goes over this. But I'm going to head in to this inner portion and I'm going to start creating some little openings in the wood that can't receive light. These are just impressions, shadows, and we're going to layer over it a number of times, build quite a few of these up, double down in different areas so that some are more prominent than others, but we do want this nice streaky dark application. So moving down here, starting at the top, just making those markings. I'm trying to make them a little less even than they currently are, so we'll just go over it a few times. You can see that little spot and starker in the middle? I love that. That's variance, and that's actually a great thing. A little more of that. And then we get to move into this nice big open area, which is a lot of fun because you just have a lot of freedom, a lot of play space to get these lines on there in a fun, unique way. You don't have to worry too much about getting that pigment in spots it shouldn't be. Just a good area and a good time. And then a little bit of texture once I start to run out of paint. Now we just have the bottom, and I'm going to apply a little bit more here because this far down we're going to have more shadows in general, so it's just not going to be as bright. There we go. At this point it should look a little messy, and that's okay. We are going to let it dry and then we'll go back in and make it look really nice. And while we wait for it to dry, we'll head back to the liner and do some extra darker details. Now, because this portion protrudes, we're just going to put a little shadow under it in an area to note that there is a raised, essentially, lip around the door here. So this is just that same shadow with the liner brush, working its way around and down, leaving that slight edge. Now, I was looking at the door, and part of the top here is wood, and then we have iron pieces with another wood piece in the middle. I'm changing mine so that this is going to be iron, this is going to be iron, and I think this is going to be a wooden separator between this top portion and the part of the door that actually swings open. So minor change, but I think it'll look less complicated and just a little bit more aesthetic. Friendly reminder, it is okay to take artistic liberties. Now, because this is going to be wood, I am just going to head back in with the base color that we had and cover up the titanium white with it. And then you can see that I'm leaving a little bit of space underneath that. I'm just going to go in with the shadow pigment and apply this because when it protrudes, the part underneath it won't be as bright. And this is essentially the same as the shadow that we had wrapping around the top. There we go. Now we'll let it all dry. Now I ran out of Mars Black on my palette, so we're going to get a bit more, and pro tip, use a pair of these guys if your acrylics ever stick. And now we'll just use that Mars Black to mix more of the same shadow tone we've been using. I'm going to create some separation between the boards within the door so that we can have openings and make it a bit more dynamic. Now with this, the openings in our door, we're going to make them through, for the most part, a vertical tap. And I'm just going to bring this all the way down, making the smallest impression that I can, but also the most consistent one, like so. And the idea here is that this is a board, and then we'll have a board beside it, and so on. We'll also paint openings, so light working through them, and that's where it'll get really neat. But we can't do that until we've kind of figured out where everything is, and we have those separative pieces. With this, I'm really taking my time, just making sure they are nice and clean. I'm also not making very elongated strokes, because if I did, I'd probably curve it in one way or another, and we don't want to do that. Now, as this dries, I feel like it's a little bit warmer than I intended, and the values are a little bit more stark. So I think we're going to do a wash. Now, this door, for the most part, is in shadow because it's inset. But as you can see by the rock that surrounds it, this is a bit more of a bluish green tint. So we need to interject that on here, and then we can interject our highlights and our warmer hues on top of that. So this just goes to show that even if your mix isn't perfect the first time, that's okay. We can edit it, and we can still do a lot for correction. For the wash, I will grab some Cerulean blue, hint of our green gold, and this is really it. We'll just make it very watery to the point where it's like watercolor, and then we'll head back into our door. So this has to be fully dry to apply it. Luckily, ours is. I'm just going to apply a little bit towards the top, and then we can either apply it down, like I'm doing here, or we can do a little finger painting, but the idea is that we just make it a bit more blue than it currently is. Alternatively, you can mix the blue into the brown as you do your initial mid-value base, but this is also going to get the job done well. All right, now that I love. Now we need a cool highlight for the wood, so highlights on the areas that have shadow. We'll start with our burnt sienna. We'll grab a little bit of our cerulean blue, titanium white, no Naples yellow because we don't want it to become too warm, but I think this mix right here will go really nicely on top of our mid-value wood. And then we can work on the highlights. Now we'll go in with our nice small flat-headed brush, as this will allow us to cut very intentionally into our previously applied areas. I'm going to do some vertical taps. I'm going to be doing some vertical drags. I just want it to look unique in all of the boards, applying as little pressure as possible. That way we get a sharp application. But I really like this. I think it's looking already a lot better, so much more character, and that's what we should be aiming for in the painting. Lots of character. And here you can see it a little bit wider, how the contrast looks with all of the boards. I'm not bringing this all the way down in singular lines, I'm breaking the lines up. And right now it's really wet, so it's really bright, but as it dries, it'll look a little bit darker. Hopefully this just lets you see the patterns I'm creating for the most part. You can see the top ones have almost fully dried, so we'll put a couple more up there. We'll continue to build those interesting patterns and textures. Also, while I'm working with this palette, I think it'll work as a nice, oh it will, wonderful, shadow for under my door. That way it just looks like the door itself is casting a little shadow. We'll soften it, but that looks really nice. We'll make the shadow also just a hint darker right at the base of the door, and it'll progressively get softer as we move out. Just like that. Bonus detail, but will make a difference in the end. Now we'll mix the iron bars that stretch across our door with some Mars Black, titanium white. We want it to be mostly gray, but I also want a hint of our cerulean blue because we want it to be cohesive with our now cool washed wood. Now going into this, I am still using that smaller flat-headed brush because I really like the control it offers and the sharp lines it renders. We'll finish off that area of open white canvas. We'll connect it to the front of the door, so I'm overlapping that darker shadow. Just like that. Make sure it's nice and thick. And now this is going to be incredibly cathartic because we are covering up our last bit of open white canvas. Still, a lot of details to be done to bring this painting to fruition, but it always feels great to just give all of it a little bit of color. Now, ideally, while it's still wet, that doesn't have to be, we'll add some extra Mars Black to that darker mix, and we'll add a nice little shadow underneath it, a bit of a lip so it's flat, and then it goes inward, and we can see that inward part on both of them. Really easy to do with this brush. Again, so fun to finally get some paint on all of the canvas. All right, good morning. We're on day probably 7 or 8 of the painting, and today is an exciting one because I think today we finish. So we're going to head in to our palette, mix up a good color for our door handle, and then we'll start working on the highlights. So for this, we actually want a very similar color to what we used for the iron, the door handle in theory, also iron, so mixed with the same palette of our cerulean blue, titanium white, and Mars Black. Now with the smaller flat-headed brush, I'm going to paint on a slightly different door handle than what I saw in the reference photo. And this would be a nice little pull kind, just like that. Nothing too dramatic. And then I'm also going to head over here and add a nice hinge to the door on the top and the bottom. Something I did not see the first time I looked at it, but it is a nice detail and addition. Now we'll make it just a touch darker so that we can have some shadows for said iron. So, because again the light's going this way, we're just going to put this on the right hand side of that little pulley door handle, and we can apply it right under our hinges with a square little application. And that's perfect. Nice and easy. So, great start to the day. Now, we're going to make sure our brushes are nice and clean because we're headed into the highlights and we don't want our blues to mix with our Naples yellow. Now we want to remix some of that nice wooden color, but we're going to add a lot more Naples yellow to it. So still a hint of titanium white and burnt sienna, but for the most part, it is Naples yellow. And maybe even a hint of Mars Black, which is such a small one. That looks beautiful. And now we're back to the liner. Shadows and highlights are interesting on the door because this part of protruding rock is going to cast a shadow on the door to essentially this point. So for this highlight to continue, it actually continues right about here on the door and not any higher. Though it will have that same curve that we had up here. And I think that looks really nice. If you can get a little bit of a scratchy texture in there, it'll look a lot more like wood. That's beautiful. Now we'll continue these highlights that we have here, but again we skip that first part of the door and we're going to go in right about here. This can also go over our really nice iron, but if we do that, we're going to bring it in much more softly than we are on the wood because it's a different texture. It'll absorb light differently, and we're going to avoid the shadows both in between the door and under the actual iron. So we'll just continue these down, being inconsistent with it because the wood is in an inconsistent texture. And I already really like it. There we go. So again, we'll skip a little bit of this area right after the lip and we'll head down. We'll build that up over here. Eventually that highlight dissipates and it stops moving towards the right, but I just want to make sure that I get enough of it. This isn't really in the reference photo, this is just making sense of the lighting scheme and trying to take artistic liberties to make it look better. But I really like the light on the door that we have so far. I think it looks natural, I think it looks beautiful. I think we're ready for the next area of it. Now I'm going to head over here and just do a little bit of light on the door handle. I think that'll make it stand out in a very pretty way. And then we'll apply some additional highlight around the wood, but less opaque, less pressure. I'm going to wait till my brush just doesn't have as much pigment. And this way, when we do it, the door handle still stands out, but we have this extra nice pop of light on the right hand side, which makes sense because this is all just so sun-soaked in general. We don't want them to start conflicting, but we do need light over here to allow the painting to really make sense. So we'll just do a bit more of that, and I'll bring it farther down than we did previously for the sake of some visual diversity. There we go. Doesn't have to be too elaborate. In fact, I think if it's a little bit more simple, that's a good thing. I'm just going back in and thickening up some of the areas that could use slightly more pigment, because we do want these highlights, at least in the center of them, to be a bit stronger, more opaque. They can get a lot softer towards the edges. And some little taps towards the top. Use pointillism to create gradients. In trees and bark, typically looks pretty good. If you want this softer texture for the iron, so I use more water in these areas than I do on the brick. Now, some of the openings between these boards are quite wide. That was intentional so that we could paint light and foliage in between them. That's our next step, and it's going to be a really unique detail. Now, we are going to apply it with the liner brush, but I am switching to the larger flathead for mixing because it's just a lot more efficient. Now, for this, we have our previous highlighted greens. We want something quite similar. So I'm going to mix in that area of the palette a lot of our green gold, a little bit of our Naples yellow. We don't want too much because I want it to still be more of a green, titanium white, and then I'll mix a second green right beside it, which is just going to be a bit darker but still brighter than anything we have in our shadows. So 2 greens, and this is the perfect amount to head in with. Now, the actual application process is again done with the liner. I'm going to go to the larger openings that we have, and I'll tap in and then do a little bit of a drag with our highlighted pigment. Just shows a little bit of that greenery behind. Trying to keep the dark application on both sides, the left and the right. So it's super small, and then I'll do hints of the darker green in between, and I'll also dot it in portions as well. That way we have multiple greens and it looks like there are shadows in the background too. Some of these will be bigger than others, and that's how it should be. We want that diversity. It's also worth noting, we're putting this right beside really bright highlights, but this looks very different because these highlights have Naples yellow, where this highlight is more of a titanium white heavy highlight. So that will add enough of a distinction factor to keep them unique enough. There we go. And if we need to, we can just go back and re-interject some shadows if we do slightly too much of this, or we just want to break it up a little bit. I'm not going to be in between every board, but a good number of them. So at this point, the door as a whole, I think is looking really great. We have a lot of depth because of the light that's coming in from behind all of these spots. I think it's speckled enough. I think it's diverse enough. It doesn't overshadow anything, and we have a lot going on. That said, something we don't have going on yet is hinges in our door. So I'm just gonna mix up a little bit of my Mars black, titanium white, cerulean blue, really dark mix. I'm just going to tap on 2 really small little areas here and here. While we're at that, we can double down on our shadows that surround our iron pieces. It would make sense if we lost a little bit of it in all of the highlights and details, so we just go back and we reestablish. We can also take some of these darker hues and tap them into surrounding rock if we want to reinstigate greater shadow. But I think that it's actually looking really, really lovely. Also, while you're working with your greens, friendly reminder, we probably painted over all of this grass with our boards here. So you might want to just repaint in a couple strands on top of the bottom of the door, and it'll just give you a lot more really easy depth in the painting. So just like that. So now we're really stepping back, and at this point I love what I'm looking at. I love the highlights, I love the details, I love how it really comes together. Though there's one thing I want to change, and it's kind of a big one. This and this look almost as if they exist within the same flat plane. This doesn't look like it's as distant as I want it to, and that's partially because it's such a sharp, complex subject, especially in relation to what we have here, but it's also because the values here are quite stark, much like what we have in the foreground. And typically, we reserve our much sharper, more dramatic contrasts for the foreground, as the background has more reflective atmospheric light. And that's what we're going to add into the background in this step. So I am back to the larger flat-headed brush. I have very clean titanium white here on my palette. It's not muddy, there aren't other pigments next to it. I'm just going to grab a little bit, I'm going to move it to a clean area on my palette. Additionally, I'm going to grab a hint of our cerulean blue. I'm going to migrate that as well. This is going to render something that is nice, bright, airy, and with a lot of water, we're going to turn it into a watercolor, essentially. I'm going to apply it over the entirety of the sky. I'm using the larger flat-headed brush to make it easy, but this is going to push that sky back in the painting. We can do so subtly, we can do so dramatically, just depends on how much we want to do. I thought about using a green gold or a Naples yellow, but I think that might just homogenize the colors a little bit too much. Where this and the cerulean blue will make it a bit cooler, much like the sky itself, and push it back because we have such a warm foreground. So this is something I'm going back and forth on many a time. We don't want to add too much too soon, otherwise it does become quite opaque. We really don't want that. We can also add more in the openings where the sky is, work in an X-shaped pattern. That way it moves not only left and right, but also up and down. And it dissipates as you move into the darker areas. That's how you make it look more diffused. That's how you give it that glowy look that you typically see in photographs. Mixing up more paint, you can see I'm doing very little amounts at a time, and that's also very intentional. Here I'm back in the middle, and then I stretch it towards the edges, just like so. I'm trying to do a lot of it wet into wet, so I'm not letting it fully dry, but I'm letting it dry enough that I'm not applying so much water that I'm beginning to rip paint off the canvas. I'm also going to start that same X-shaped process up here because we have a lot of opening in the sky, and that should dissipate downwards into the left in the same way that this area does. Really, any area that has a larger opening will have this diffused blooming effect, and that's what we're doing right there. That said, I'm going to let that sit for a couple of minutes. Don't want to overdo it, don't want to rip that paint off. In the meantime, I'm back to the liner, and I'm back to adding some nice highlights with our green gold, our Naples yellow, our titanium white, to areas in the painting where we feel like there could just be slightly more of a transition between those highlights. We're in the final stretch. We're finishing up our favorite parts, and we're getting really close. So I hope at this point you're feeling as happy and fulfilled and excited about painting as I am. You probably still hear a little bit of morning voice in me because I woke up this morning and I just said, I have to paint. I just have to get back to that canvas. We are so close. I love it. I know where I want to hang it in the home, and it's such a good feeling. So I hope you're feeling that too. If you're painting along, I hope you're at that point where you're just excited. If you're watching it first, I hope you're finding a lot of motivation, inspiration to get to that canvas as I am here. I know that the drawing's a bit tricky, but you can do it. And again, if you don't love the drawing process, you can simply download the traceable up over on Patreon. There's always a link in the description. And up there you can also watch this ad-free. You've already watched it. So I feel like you made your decision there, and that's okay. But if you'd like videos in the future without ads, you can do that. We also have a Facebook group you can get access to up over on Facebook where everybody shares their renditions of these pieces. I always get inspired when I pop in there and I see what people are working on. It's one of those things where you find a lot of unique personal touches to paintings you wouldn't think about, and it's just a really lovely experience. A lot of wonderful people. In addition, you can get all of my ebooks, which includes Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials. Everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into it. You can get the traceable books and all of that fun stuff. But it's also just a great way to support the channel if you'd like to. If you can't, absolutely no worries. I totally understand. I just hope you enjoyed. I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate you taking the time. I think that it's wonderful when people still have a passion for traditional mediums like painting, and I feel like we're keeping it alive together. I think it's very much worth keeping alive and continuing to celebrate. So that's what we're doing. That's what we're going to keep doing. I have the next painting pre-planned. I've already written out a lot of the steps where we're going to work on a really beautiful sunset beach, and then after that I have a couple more ideas, but we are moving into fall, so we're going to get very colorful with our palettes. It's an exciting time of the year for painting. We get to use a lot of colors we don't normally get to, but we are ending off summer strong with a couple more, and again, I think this really just feels like summer. So I have this problem where I just keep painting and I keep talking at the end of these videos because I love it and I don't want to put the brush down. And that's definitely happening again. So I'm going to make a conscious effort to take the brush away and say, you know what? That right there is a beautiful painting. Hope you love your version. I will see you soon with a brand new painting. If you'd like to work with the same brushes I'm using, there's also a link in the description. And you can find the big bonus videos up over on Patreon too. So a bunch of stuff if you're interested, but otherwise I'll see you very soon with a brand new painting right here on this channel. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of the community. And above all, as always, you stay creative. Also, big bonus and shout out and thank you to my incredible partner Athena for filming all of this. Fantastic cinematographer. Couldn't do it without her. These videos got so much better when she started doing this. Big thank you to her. And again, stay creative. Thank you.